You sit before me tonight with a familiar tension beneath your ribs, a tension I've seen in countless souls who arrive at the threshold of transformation without yet knowing that they stand upon it. There is a subtle tremor in the psyche at such moments, not of fear alone, but of recognition. Something within you knows, perhaps for the first time in years, that the life you have been living is too small, too narrow, too polished on the surface, and too turbulent underneath. Something knows that you have been avoiding a truth that belongs to you, and that the truth has grown tired of waiting in the dark. And so it sends signals, it sends dreams, it sends moments where old emotions rise suddenly, inexplicably, as if summoned by an unseen hand. It sends a sense of haunting, though not by ghosts, but by the unlived life within you. For decades I have observed that the part of you most feared, most resisted, most exiled is the very part that longs to save you, not by rescuing you from fate, but by revealing fate, not by making life easier, but by making it meaningful. This part is what I have called the shadow, and you are not here today to learn intellectually about it. You are here because the shadow has begun to speak to you, and it is no longer willing to be ignored. People imagine the shadow as darkness or evil, but that is a childish simplification. A shadow is simply what the light of consciousness has not yet illuminated. It is made of emotions you were not allowed to feel, desires you were not allowed to express, truths you were not allowed to acknowledge, and potentials you never dared to embody. It is the unloved child within your soul, waiting behind the door that has remained locked for far too long. And like any abandoned child, it does not disappear simply because you pretend it is not there. It grows louder, angrier, more desperate for your attention. It begins to sabotage, not out of malice, but because it has no other language with which to speak. When I speak of the shadow saving your life, I do not use the word lightly. The ego alone cannot carry the full weight of existence. It collapses under expectations, masks, duties, social conditioning, and the relentless pressure to remain consistent with a story you outgrew years ago. The ego tries to maintain order, but the psyche is larger, older, and wilder. There comes a time when the life you are performing can no longer contain the life you are meant to live. And in that moment, the shadow rises like a subterranean tide. What you call crisis is often only the soul rearranging itself to make room for the truth. Imagine a dream I once analyzed of a young woman who stood before a locked basement door. She heard sobbing behind it, the sound of a child crying alone in the dark. She was afraid to open the door, afraid of what she would find, afraid of being overwhelmed. Yet, the more she avoided it, the louder the crying became, echoing through her waking life until she could no longer concentrate, sleep, or breathe with ease. One day she finally gathered the courage to open the door, and she descended the stairs with trembling hands. There, in the center of the room, she found a small boy sitting alone, thin, pale, barely breathing. When she approached him, expecting him to attack or scream, he instead looked up and whispered, "I've been waiting for you." That child was her shadow, the part of her that had been carrying her pain so she could survive. All of you have left someone like this in the basement of the psyche, and all of you are being called home to retrieve them. The door will not stay locked forever. Something in your life will force it open if you refuse to open it yourself. And such forced encounters often manifest as depression, anxiety, compulsions, addictions, relational chaos, or the sudden collapse of an identity you thought was stable. Healing, therefore, does not begin with striving for light. Healing begins with descending into the basement with a lantern in your hand and the willingness to meet what you abandoned. You cannot integrate what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot become whole while disowning parts of yourself. And the longer you avoid the shadow, the more fragmented you become. The paradox is that the shadow contains not only your wounds, but also your wisdom. Not only your fear, but also your courage. Not only your anger, but also your boundaries. Not only your impulsivity, but also your passion. The shadow carries the raw instincts that civilization told you to suppress. The emotional truths your family taught you to hide. The intuition that society mocked out of you, and the power you were punished for expressing. The shadow is the well where your vitality waits, undrinkable only because you fear the darkness around it. Tonight, I ask you a question that only your soul can answer. What is the part of you that you have most feared becoming? The answer is never random. It is the gateway to integration. If you fear being selfish, your shadow contains your unclaimed self-respect. If you fear being angry, your shadow contains your unspoken truth. If you fear being powerful, your shadow contains your dormant strength. And if you fear being abandoned, your shadow contains the version of you who no longer begs for love, but embodies it. There was once a man who dreamed repeatedly of being chased by a wolf through a dense forest. The wolf was enormous, its eyes glowing with a mixture of threat and intelligence. Every night, the man ran until his lungs burned, his legs failed, and he woke up drenched in sweat. He came to me desperate, exhausted, pleading for the dream to stop. When I asked him why he thought the wolf chased him, he said, "Because it wants to destroy me." Yet when I asked him to describe the wolf carefully, he admitted that it was strong, confident, and unafraid. Everything he himself was not. And then the dream changed. One night, instead of running, he turned around. He faced the wolf, chest heaving, heart trembling, and the wolf stopped. It did not attack. It simply waited. The man reached out his hand. The wolf bowed its head. This is what happens when you turn toward the shadow. The thing you believe will devour you becomes the thing that guides you. The thing you feared becomes the instinct that protects you. The thing you rejected becomes the ally you never knew you needed. Your transformation does not come from transcending the shadow. It comes from walking beside it. It comes from acknowledging that the psyche is not divided between good and bad, but between conscious and unconscious. What you reject goes into the unconscious, gaining force precisely because it is hidden from your control. Integration gives it form. Awareness gives it direction. Acceptance gives it a voice that no longer needs to scream. You must understand that the shadow is older than your personality. It has roots in archetypal patterns far beyond your individual history. In every myth, the hero descends into darkness, not to become lost, but to be strengthened. In every ancient story, the gods hide their wisdom in places mortals fear to enter, and in every psyche, the shadow guards the gate to the self, which is the center of your being, the source of meaning, and the architect of your true destiny. Some of you are living a half-life because you are terrified of your own depths. You have been trained to fear your sadness, so you repress it and call it strength. You have been told to avoid conflict, so you swallow your truth until your voice disappears. You have been taught to please others, so you become a ghost in your own story. But the psyche is not fooled. It knows what you have abandoned. And so it sends you signs disguised as discomfort, symptoms disguised as weakness, suffering disguised as failure, not to punish you, but to awaken you. The moment you stop running from the shadow, your life begins to shift. Reality bends toward your inner transformation. People who once intimidated you lose their power over your emotions. Patterns that once held you captive begin to unravel. You find yourself acting from a place of clarity rather than compulsion, from strength rather than fear, from authenticity rather than survival. For the first time, you become capable of choosing your life instead of reenacting your wounds. And now, as I look at you, I see that you are closer to this threshold than you realize. The shadow has already been knocking on your door. It has already entered your dreams, your arguments, your restless nights, your quiet questions. It is not coming to destroy you. It is coming to return you to yourself. You must understand something essential before we continue. The psyche is not trying to harm you. Even the parts of you that sabotage your plans, disrupt your relationships, or push you into emotional storms are not malicious forces. They are messengers. They are fragments of your own being attempting to communicate truths that your conscious mind has been unwilling or unable to hear. When you resist these messages, when you deny the inner voice that rises from the depths, the psyche amplifies its language. What begins as a whisper becomes a symptom, and what begins as discomfort becomes crisis. The soul does not speak in words alone. It speaks in patterns, in symbols, in unexpected emotional surges, in obsessions, in dreams that refuse to be forgotten. And when these messages come from the shadow, they come with a potency that feels almost mythological. I have often said that modern people are not suffering from a lack of information, but from a lack of meaning. And meaning arises only when we reconnect with the hidden layers of ourselves. When we confront the shadow and allow it to guide us into deeper territory. You cannot experience wholeness while clinging only to the polished aspects of your identity. Light without darkness is blinding. A persona without a shadow is fragile. A self-image built on repression is destined to shatter. Consider a man who strives always to be calm, composed, agreeable, and moral. On the surface, he appears balanced, trustworthy, admirable, but beneath the surface, a storm brews. His anger has no place to go, so it accumulates like stagnant water. His desires are unexpressed, so they twist into fantasies that frighten him. His instincts are denied, so when they erupt, they do so with a violence that surprises even him. This man does not become dangerous because he has a shadow. He becomes dangerous because he refuses to know it. And the more he avoids it, the more control it gains over him. Eventually, he becomes the very thing he fears. Not because he embraced the darkness, but because he tried to pretend it did not exist. Now imagine another person, one who has been taught since childhood that vulnerability is weakness. This individual grows into adulthood with a rigid outer shell, always strong, always capable, always self-reliant, but the shadow contains the abandoned softness, the unexpressed grief, the unmet longing for connection. When this person finally encounters a moment of profound loss or emotional intimacy, the suppressed vulnerability bursts forth like a dam breaking. They find themselves overwhelmed by emotions they were never allowed to feel, drowning in their own humanity because they were never taught to swim in those waters. And yet, that breakthrough is precisely the beginning of their becoming. Their shadow, the very vulnerability they avoided, was the gateway to compassion, to depth, to authentic connection with others. This is why the shadow is not your enemy. It is your estranged teacher. In every mythological tradition, the hero is required to face a monster, a dark figure, or a descent into the underworld before returning transformed. These images are not mere stories. They reflect deep psychological truths. The monster always guards treasure. The darkness always hides knowledge. The underworld always holds the key to rebirth. And your shadow functions in the same way within your psyche. If you run from it, you remain spiritually stagnant. If you confront it, you awaken. But let me be precise here. Confronting the shadow does not mean indulging it. Integration is not the same as identification. When you identify with the shadow, you become consumed by it. When you integrate the shadow, you allow it to reveal its wisdom without surrendering your moral center. Integration is a relationship, not a collapse. It requires dialogue, not domination. It requires attention, not fear. There was once a patient, a quiet scholar whose intellect was razor sharp, but whose emotional life was barren. He lived entirely in the realm of thought, avoiding anything that stirred his feeling nature, but his dreams betrayed him. Night after night he encountered a woman in black robes, her face veiled, her presence both alluring and terrifying. She stood at the edge of a forest, beckoning him to follow. For months he resisted, analyzing her symbolically, dissecting her as an idea rather than meeting her as an emotional reality. But one night the dream forced his hand. The woman removed her veil, and instead of a seductress or a monster, he saw his own face, pale, hollow, starved of feeling. The veiled woman, his anima, was showing him what he had lost in his pursuit of intellect. She was asking him to return to the forest of the soul, to rediscover a part of himself he had abandoned. And so he did, slowly, painfully, courageously. He learned to feel again. He learned to love. He learned to suffer consciously rather than numbing himself with ideas. And in doing so, he became whole. Many of you sitting here carry within you such veiled figures. They appear as shadows in dreams, as sudden emotional reactions in waking life, as inexplicable attractions or aversions. You label them irrational, but the unconscious does not speak in logic, it speaks in symbol. And the symbol is the language of the soul. When something irrational rises within you, an old fear, a sudden anger, a longing, you cannot explain it, is not a mistake. It is the psyche knocking on the door of your awareness, asking to be understood. Consider the paradox that the part of you most capable of saving your entire life is the very part you have been trained to avoid. If you fear conflict, your shadow contains your courage. If you fear disappointment, your shadow contains your resilience. If you fear being alone, your shadow contains your independence. If you fear being seen, your shadow contains your authenticity. Every fear you carry points directly to a potency you have not yet claimed. There is a phenomenon I have observed countless times: individuals who spend years seeking healing, reading books, attending seminars, learning methods, yet they continue to feel stuck. And the reason is simple. They are trying to heal while avoiding the one place the healing resides. They want change without dissent, light without shadow, transformation without discomfort. But the psyche does not work that way. You cannot ascend without first grounding yourself in the truth of who you are. And the truth is vast, complex, contradictory, and often unsettling. Let me give you another dream as an illustration. A man stood in a cathedral filled with stained glass windows. Each window depicted a moment from his life's successes, relationships, achievements, moments of pride. The light shining through the windows was brilliant, illuminating the entire space. But then he noticed one window covered by a heavy black cloth. When he approached it, he felt fear rise in his chest. Something in him knew that this hidden window contained the memory he had spent his entire life trying to forget. As he lifted the cloth, he saw an image of himself as a child, crying alone in a dark room, rejected and unseen. The moment he uncovered the window, the entire cathedral darkened, the light faded, and in the silence, he realized that he had built his whole identity on avoiding that memory. His persona was a cathedral of stained glass, alluring and impressive, but incomplete. When he finally acknowledged the hidden window, the cathedral did not collapse. Instead, a single beam of light pierced through the darkness, brighter than any other window. It illuminated the entire space with a warmth he had never felt before. This dream reveals a truth. Many resist your deepest wound, is often the source of your deepest light, not because suffering is noble, but because the soul contains an alchemical intelligence. It transforms what is unconscious into wisdom, what is painful into insight, what is feared into power, but only if you face it. You are not here tonight to receive comfort. You are here to receive clarity. The shadow does not demand that you become perfect. It demands that you become honest. Honesty with yourself is the beginning of individuation. And individuation is the process by which you become who you truly are, rather than who you were taught to be. It is the slow, steady unfolding of your inner nature, guided by the self rather than the ego. When you begin this process, the world may not understand you. People who benefit from your compliance will protest. People who rely on your silence will resist. People who are intimidated by their own shadow will project it onto you. But this too is part of the journey. Individuation requires the courage to disappoint others for the sake of not betraying yourself. The moment you turn inward, the moment you face the part of you that you have avoided, a profound shift occurs. You stop seeking approval and begin seeking authenticity. You stop numbing yourself and begin listening. You stop surviving and begin living. The shadow once feared, once exiled, becomes the compass that leads you back to your own soul. Do not fear this journey. Fear stagnation. Fear the life half lived. Fear the person you become when you suppress your truth. But do not fear the shadow. It holds more salvation than danger, more wisdom than chaos, more strength than fear. The part of you that you have avoided is the part that has been waiting to bring you home. There comes a moment in every individual's inner journey when the shadow no longer appears as an enemy lurking in the darkness, but as a figure waiting patiently for recognition. And the moment this recognition dawns, even faintly, the psyche begins to reorganize itself. Old patterns loosen their grip. Emotions, once overwhelming, begin to soften. The gaze turns inward, not with dread, but with curiosity. It is as though the soul itself exhales, relieved that at last the forgotten parts of you are being invited into the light of awareness. And yet, this moment of recognition is often preceded by chaos. For before the shadow becomes your ally, it tests your willingness to meet it truthfully. It stirs the waters. It brings buried emotions to the surface. It challenges your illusions. It dismantles the persona you spent years constructing to avoid discomfort. But this dismantling is not destruction, it is initiation. There is a peculiar suffering that arises from avoiding who you truly are. It is not the suffering of tragedy or heartbreak alone, though those may accompany it, but a deeper suffering born of self-abandonment, when you abandon the parts of yourself that do not fit the image you wish to present, you begin to fracture internally. You become divided, not between good and evil, but between the conscious mask and the unconscious truth. And this division weakens you, drains you, exhausts you in ways you cannot name. People describe it as burnout, emptiness, numbness, or feeling lost. But beneath all these symptoms lies the same root, a life lived at a distance from the self. To reclaim the shadow, therefore, is to end this inner exile. It is to allow the parts of you that have been silenced to speak once more, not in violent eruptions or unconscious behaviors, but in conscious dialogue. Imagine walking into a dimly lit room where someone you abandoned years ago sits waiting. Their eyes reflect all the pain you once felt, all the anger you swallowed, all the dreams you dismissed as impractical, and yet beneath that pain is something else potential. The shadow is the container of everything you were afraid to become. It holds your suppressed creativity, your dormant courage, your untapped intuition, your wildness, your authenticity, your truth. When you avoid the shadow, you avoid your life force. Consider again the archetypal patterns that govern this inner journey. In myth, the hero does not simply fight monsters. The hero must understand them. The monsters are never random. They symbolize inner forces that must be integrated for the hero to achieve wholeness. In the story of Beowulf, the monster Grendel emerges from the darkness not merely to terrorize, but to reveal the weaknesses of the community. In Greek myth, the Minotaur in the labyrinth represents the shadow of an entire civilization, its secrets, its shame, its untamed instincts, and in the psychological life of every individual, the shadow plays this same role. It disrupts not to destroy but to reveal. It confronts not to harm but to awaken. When you understand this, you stop fearing the appearance of inner conflict. You begin to track it like a clue. There was once a patient who came to me full of despair, certain that he was falling apart. He spoke of sudden rage that erupted without warning, of inexplicable sadness, of impulses that frightened him. He believed he was regressing, becoming unstable. But when we explored these eruptions, it became clear that something deeper was happening. He had spent decades suppressing his true desires out of duty to a life that no longer fit him. His shadow, the part of him that refused to live half alive, was rising not to destroy his stability, but to destroy his falseness. And once he recognized this, his fear turned into insight. His rage revealed boundaries he had never set. His sadness revealed losses he had never grieved. His impulses revealed paths he had never allowed himself to take. This is what I mean when I say the shadow will save your life. It disrupts what is false so that what is true can emerge. Every human being carries within them an unlived life. Sometimes it appears as yearning, sometimes as regret, sometimes as a vague sense that something essential is missing. But rarely do people understand that the unlived life is not merely a fantasy. It is a psychological force. The shadow carries the blueprint of who you might become if you were not bound by fear, conditioning, or expectation. And because the psyche seeks wholeness, the unlived life does not remain silent. It presses against the edges of your awareness, demanding expression. If you ignore it, it becomes bitterness. If you suppress it, it becomes illness. If you reject it, it becomes envy of those who live freely. But if you turn toward it, if you listen, if you allow it to speak, it becomes destiny. One of the most profound symbols for this process is found in alchemy, where lead represents the unrefined, heavy aspects of the psyche, and gold represents the awakened self. The alchemists understood that lead is not discarded, it is transformed. And your shadow is this psychic lead. The very material you reject is the material through which your gold is produced. Integration is an alchemical process. It requires heat, emotional intensity, confrontation with truth, willingness to feel deeply. It requires dissolution, allowing old identities to fall away. And it requires coagulation, reforming the psyche around a more authentic center. This process is not linear, it is cyclical, spiraling, alive. Let me offer a symbolic dream to illuminate this. A woman found herself walking through a vast desert under a moonless sky. She was thirsty, exhausted, certain she would not survive. In the distance she saw a black figure, indistinguishable but undeniably human-shaped, terrified. She wanted to run, but she could not move. The figure approached until she realized it was her own shadow cast by a light she could not see. When the shadow reached her, it merged with her body, and she suddenly felt strength surge through her limbs. The desert transformed into a lush landscape. A hidden spring appeared at her feet, and when she looked up, she saw a radiant sun emerging over the horizon. The meaning was clear. The shadow was not an enemy, but a returning aspect of her strength. The desert was her life without integration. The spring was her vitality restored. You cannot heal while abandoning the parts of you that hold your vitality. Many people come to me asking for clarity, peace, purpose, but they avoid the one thing that will give them all three inner descent. They fear the darkness within them because they have associated darkness with danger. But in psychological work, darkness simply means the unknown. And the unknown is where your transformation lives. Ask yourself, what versions of you have you banished? Perhaps the assertive one who spoke too loudly. Perhaps the passionate one who loved too intensely. Perhaps the creative one who dared to dream. Perhaps the intuitive one who sensed truths others could not. Perhaps the grieving one who was never allowed to cry. These parts did not disappear. They became shadow, and they wait for you still. When people begin this work, they often experience a strange duality. On the one hand, they feel more alive, more authentic, more grounded. On the other hand, they feel vulnerable, exposed, uncertain. This is because the persona, the mask you show the world, is no longer able to control everything. It begins to crack, and through those cracks, the truth shines. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is a sign that the inner walls of repression are dissolving. It is the first breath of your real self. Another phenomenon becomes apparent during shadow integration synchronicity. When you begin aligning with your inner truth, the outer world often mirrors this alignment in mysterious ways. You meet people at the exact moment you are ready for them. Opportunities appear that resonate precisely with the parts of you that are awakening. You feel guided, not by logic, but by meaning, and meaning is the language of the self. The self is the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, past and future.